Hello, friends. Welcome back to Colliding Worldviews. It's so great to have you with me here every single week as we talk about the worldviews that collide. And many times that is between Christianity and Islam. No different today. It's great to have you back here as we continually prepare the world for what is coming, at least in the minds of Muslims who are following their supposed prophet and what he told them to do. And of course, we all are also proclaiming the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ and defending the historic Christian faith as well. Today, here on Colliding Worldviews, I am so blessed to have a man with me who's been here a number of times before, and he is an author of now 3 books. I want to encourage you to get all 3 of them. The first one is called The Al-Qaeda Reader. It's been out for a number of years now, but has a lot of great information in there if you want to learn about the mindset of many jihadists throughout the world. Also, Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians. This will get you up to date on the continued persecution that's happening throughout the world, that's been happening and continues to happen. And of course, you definitely need to get his brand new book called Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. Yes, my guest is none other than Raymond Ibrahim from RaymondIbrahim.com. He's an author, and he's an Islam and Middle East specialist as well. Raymond, it's great to have you back here on Colliding Worldviews.
Hi, Tony. Thank you for that great introduction. Good to be with you again.
Raymond, what sets this book apart from all the other books that are out there on the history of Islam?
There's, I think, about 3 main reasons. The first is most books that deal with the history of Islam, jihad, and that sort of thing, because it's such a long and comprehensive history, they can't help it. They have to segment it and just focus on certain epics, certain branches of this 14th century jihad. So you'll have books that just focus on the Arab conquest, books about the Ottomans, books about the war around the Mediterranean, that sort of thing. So I think it makes it different in that I took really the entire jihad on the West, 14 centuries worth, and distilled it and tried to get really the most important points out, including a lot of primary sources. So I think it gives you a more holistic take about the Islamic jihad against the West, the historic one, as opposed to other books that just really focus on one particular group, as I mentioned. The other thing is I wrote it in a way because my forte, my background academically dealt a lot with military history. And so I wrote the 8 chapters of the book all center around one of 8 of the most decisive battles between Islam and the West. Some of these are familiar to people, such as the Battle of Tours, 732, or the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683. Others are not familiar, such as the Battle of Yarmouk, the earlier sieges of Constantinople, battles in Spain, for example. And these are actually sometimes even more decisive and important. So I wrote the book, the narrative really revolves around these battles, and usually the battle comes in the center of a chapter. So you get the prelude, and then you get the aftermath, and you see how these battles, the impact they had decisively on history. And the final way I think it's important is I did a lot of translation work and a lot of research into foreign languages, that, including some items that to my knowledge, have never been translated before, mostly from Arabic sources, historical sources, but also I did some work with Greek and Latin, again, in items that I'm pretty sure I haven't seen before. So, and a lot of the sources really I rely on, and I think this is an important point, are Islamic sources. And I think it's important because the Islamic sources really stress the jihad component of this war. Because when you use just Western sources, a lot of people will say, well, these are just Islamophobic, medieval Christians who are just saying whatever about Islam. But when you really look at the Islamic sources, Ottoman chronicles and Arabic chronicles, and even Persian chronicles and so forth, you'll find that the jihad concept is regularly brought up, even more so than in Western sources. So I think those 3 are different from the books that I've seen that deal with this same topic.
And this is a great book. I want to encourage our viewers to go to your website, RaymondIbrahim.com, to get all 3 of these books. That's how you can support Raymond best. Also, Raymond, just in the introduction alone, you brought up a really good point. Here, today we talk about the West, and usually we're referring to the non-Islamic areas of the world, or usually we say the West, we're referring to the United States, Canada, Europe, places that aren't Islamized yet, although we do see this ongoing creeping Sharia. But in the book, you make a very important distinction between the word West and actually Christendom. If we look back to history, can you clear up the maybe confusion between those two terms for us?
Sure, and that I think is, like you say, a very important point that most people don't understand. But the word "the West," it's called that for a reason. It's a direction, and what it is when you look historically now, when we think of the West, we think of Europe, but of course it extended westward across the Atlantic and so forth. But really, Europe proper is what the origins of the West is. But if you look at it, if you look at the map, okay, Europe is really the westernmost edge of what was once a much larger cohesive civilization, which was called Christendom. So in the 7th century, when Islam came onto the scene, and you looked at the Christian world, it mostly existed in North Africa, from modern day names, from Morocco to Egypt, and all of Southwest Asia, the Middle East, what we call today Greater Syria, essentially, and Turkey or Anatolia, and then parts of Europe, southwest of the Danube and Rhine, that part of Europe. So when you look at it, that was the Christian world. And really, the southern part, North Africa, and the eastern part, the Middle East, was the heart of the Christian world. And that's why Constantine eventually moved the capital from Rome to New Rome or Constantinople in modern day Turkey. So when Islam came, that was the civilizational bloc, and it got chipped and broken down. North Africa was all, as we know, taken over through violent conquest, all of the Middle East, Egypt, Syria, eventually Anatolia, Turkey, into the Balkans, into Spain. Of course, it was eventually repulsed. But so what you really have with the West, and that's why a lot of older historians will point out that the very idea, not just of the West, but the very existence of it is completely a byproduct of centuries of jihadi attacks. Because what it became was the last bastion of Christendom that still survived and repulsed Islam, fought Islam. Well, sometimes it was on the defensive, sometimes it was on the offensive, such as the Crusades, for instance. But its identity was very much a byproduct. When you look again at the map, so Europe is really part of Asia, and there's that other term, Eurasia. So what really made Europe so distinct from Asia? It's all part of the same landmass. You can walk from France to China, literally. And again, it's that Christian identity. It was that last part where Christendom kept getting attacked from all corners by Islam, from North Africa when it became Islamic, and of course from the Ottomans in the east, and also the Mongols when they became Islamic, the Tatars, and they were also attacking into Russia. And so all the Christian peoples that were left became Europe. And that's why it's such a small landmass, and yet you have so many different ethnicities, different languages. The only thing that really kept them together and that really defined their geography and their civilization and culture was Christianity. But of course, we don't remember any of that. We just think Europe was its own thing, and Islam somehow was always there. You tell, as you probably know, you tell people there's Christians being persecuted in Egypt or Syria or wherever, and they'll say, well, what are they doing in an Islamic country? And again, that just shows you the ignorance, because they're unaware that those so-called Islamic nations were originally even more Christian than Christendom of Europe, of the medieval Christendom. So there's a lot of that ignorance, which, as you point out, I do try to clarify and connect the dots for in the book, in Sword and Scimitar.
And it's very important too. So everyone in the West needs to realize that when we say the West, it's better defined as what's left of Christendom. If we go back in history, Raymond, we see in your great books, you remind people that the Muslims were once just in what we now know as Saudi Arabia, or the Arabian Peninsula back then, North Africa, all these other places that are now under Islam were not. They were even more Christian than any other place in the West today. And people need to be reminded about that. And we are definitely going to get more into that. But I want to ask you about these different battles that you talk about in the book. Again, friends, you're going to get a passenger seat view of these battles, because Raymond gives a ton of details. He quotes all kinds of sources. Again, excellent book. Raymond, the first battle you talk about is the Battle of Yarmouk. Why was that such a decisive one in history? And even follow that up with what could have been if that battle was lost rather than won by the Muslims.
Sure. The Battle of Yarmouk, I quote one historian, a 19th century European historian, I forget his name, I think it's Francisco Gabrielli, an Orientalist. And he really, the quotes in the book, in that chapter 1, he basically called the Battle of Yarmouk the most decisive and consequential battle in all world history, not just in encounters between Islam and Christendom, or Islam and the West, just in all history. And the reason is, this was the first major encounter between Islam and the West, okay, in the guise of the Byzantine or the Eastern Roman Empire, the Christian Roman Empire. And as you were saying, the Arabs, of course, and Islam was once entirely confined to the Arabian Peninsula. That's its homeland. That's where it was born. Muhammad was an Arab and so forth. But then they started spreading out soon after he died, particularly under the second Caliph, Caliph Omar I. And so by 636, long story short, this is only 4 years after the traditional death date for Muhammad, 632. So just 4 years later, the Arabs had finally, their incursions into Christian territory had brought them to the Yarmouk River in Syria. And the Byzantine Emperor, Heraclius, actually had mobilized a humongous force because the Arabs were winning. And he just figured, enough's enough. And he called all these different men, he called his banners from all over Europe and North Africa and so forth. And he got a very large army, and he managed to crush them once and for all. And so they met at the River Yarmouk by Syria in late August of 636. And the details, of course, are all in the book. This battle, by the way, is very dear to me because I wrote my master's thesis about this battle almost 20 years ago. So I've really been focusing and studying this battle for a long time. But all the details are in the book. But long story short, the Arabs won. No surprise there, because I already pointed that out. And after that, they were able to, just like dominoes, keep invading westward. And so it was just a couple of years after that, they were in Egypt, and Egypt fell. And then they continued going westward, eventually Libya, to give it its modern day name. All of Syria, of course, had fallen after that battle. And so that's why, as I was quoting that one historian, it's considered very consequential, because after that, you have the birth of the Islamic Empire. And then from those nations that got conquered in North Africa and in the Middle East, you had all the bases that continued waging jihad eventually into Europe. So after all of North Africa, after the westward jihad from the Battle of Yarmouk in 636 had reached Morocco, again, modern day name, and conquered it, now it's went into Spain, into Europe proper. So without that battle, had that not happened, there was a good chance that Islam could have been snuffed out right then and there, or at least confined to its homeland. And that's why really and the irony of that battle is it's so little known. So as you recall, earlier I was mentioning some of the more famous battles that people, Lepanto, Vienna, Tours, and so forth, but almost nobody knows the Battle of Yarmouk, and yet it's probably the most consequential battle in the entire book, because it gave birth to the Islamic world. It gave birth to what we were talking about, how Christendom kept shrinking westward until all you had was Europe, just little portions of Europe, even at points, because there was a point where Spain was conquered, the Balkans were conquered, all the Mediterranean islands were conquered, Iceland was being raided. So the West kept shrinking. Now, of course, all that changed eventually. But that is the significance of Yarmouk. Without it, it's impossible to tell if the dynamic expansion of Islam would have unfolded. Certainly not the way it did, probably not. But it's hard to tell what would have happened at that point.
And when people read your book, they can see right away that this was not defensive fighting like political Islamists try to tell us today. This is obviously offensive jihad. Speaking of that, we see throughout the book all these different battles, this jihad being waged, where today people say that jihad's an inward struggle. that there are rules of engagement that Muslims have always followed. Like, for example, you should never kill dhimmis, which is the third-class citizens, the women, the children. Now, I want to reference your Al-Qaeda reader because you reference it yourself in your brand new book. And it says, there's a quote here. It says, often mixed among the infidels whom the mujahideen target in warfare are those whom it is not permitted to kill, such as Muslims, dhimmis, women and children, and so forth. So is jihad, which is assigned to us, to be abandoned on account of their protected blood? Or is killing one such as these accidentally, not on purpose, forgiven in the face of the highest goods that would be realized from waging jihad against the infidels, the enemies of Allah Supreme? So how do you answer that question with the claim today that you shouldn't kill other Muslims, women, children, or dhimmis?
Well, that quote that you just read is my translation of Ayman Zawahiri, who's currently the Al-Qaeda leader. At the time, he was the #2 man. And he is basically responding to the apologetic that you just mentioned, which is, when Islamic terrorists do some sort of indiscriminate bombing and so forth, and they kill women and children, or they kill innocent Muslims, then obviously that has nothing to do with Islam. So he's responding to it. And, that last thing that you quoted is a very overarching and important concept that must be recalled in Islam. And it's basically, I won't say it in Arabic, but basically it means that it's all about your intention, your niyyah, okay? And the ends justify the means. Therefore, if the greatest end, and it is to expand Islam, to glorify Islam, empower Islamic rule, Sharia, empower the expansion of the caliphate. Okay, these are all wonderful goals that every Muslim should be committed to, because that's the jihad. Okay, whether you do it with arms or spiritually or however you do this, it's all a struggle to empower Islam. So if that's the greatest end, then the means to get to that end, there's a lot of leeway. Okay, and so this is what he's basically saying. So if we are trying to empower Islam and we are doing some terrorist attack and women and children die, even though, let's say, the Prophet, according to one version, said don't kill women and children, well, we have to think about it, he's saying, because the greater good is to empower Islam. But more to the point, and he discusses it in that same tract that you're reading from in the Al-Qaeda Reader, he quotes Muhammad, which really puts an end to this whole debate. Sometime when Muhammad was besieging the town of Ta'if in Arabia, they were still pagans and had not submitted to Islam. And I believe he was using either catapults or setting fire at night, something of that sort. And it's in the book that you just read from. And one of the Muslims said, well, what about the women and children? They might get killed because it's a night raid or because we're using indiscriminate catapults. And Muhammad's terse answer was simply, they are from among them. They, women and children, are from among them, the infidels. So they get the same, they get the same just desserts. Okay, that's how it's been understood by a lot of the ulama or the Islamic scholars. And eventually, Ayman Zawahiri, that's the point he focuses on. So it's not only about our intention and the ends, empowering Islam, justifying the means, but Muhammad himself said it's okay. And he himself engaged in that, despite the well-known apologetic that he said women and children should be spared, et cetera, et cetera.
And another quote that we hear all the time, and of course going back to the Quran itself, is still quoted today, and it was even believed, of course, by the Muslims who you talk about in these different battles, and that is there's no compulsion in religion. Now, obviously, no human being can get inside the mind of another human being and make them either accept Islam or deny it. But what is with this whole no compulsion in religion in light of history and in the battles that you present in your book?
Right, and that's a good point. The Quran does say that, but and this is the thing. There's what the Quran says, there's what Muhammad says, there's Islamic doctrine, teaching, and so forth, and then there's what Muslims did on the ground. And by the way, this is one of the main reasons I wanted to write this book, Sword and Scimitar. I wanted to basically say, let's put aside the doctrine of Islam, which a lot of us are familiar with. Usually when Islam comes under criticism, it's from a doctrinal point of view. Someone says Muhammad said this, Sharia teaches that, the Quran says this. Okay, fine. But I figured let's put that aside and actually see what did Muslims do to and in the West historically. So let's put doctrines aside. And, long story short, just think of ISIS, but, to the 100th power for 14 centuries, or really 12 centuries until Islam started getting weaker and making a comeback recently. So all that sort of thing that, ISIS, we're told, is doing, but it's not Islamic, forced conversions, cutting people's heads off, for example, the 20 Copts and the one African fellow, the Christians who were killed, they were asked to convert to Islam. They didn't, so they cut off their heads. You find that all throughout this history in Sword and Scimitar. Every single chapter, you have anecdotes of attacks on women and children, as we were saying, being justified in the same context that we were discussing. Forced conversions, all these sorts of things, they keep cropping up over and over. And then someone will come and tell you, well, but the Quran says, there's no compulsion in Islam. Okay, so I have two responses to that. One is, the problem is, let's say the Quran is saying that you should never force someone to convert to Islam, okay? And this comes up repeatedly. I've actually written recently about it. It's an important point. A lot of the nitpicking that the apologists for Islam do it reminds me of Christ's statement, which is, that you strain at a gnat and you swallow a camel. So I'll give you a quick example. An Egyptian cleric came up making this big song and dance saying how, these terrorists are wrong because they quote Muhammad saying that a Muslim's blood is more valuable than an infidel's. Therefore, you can never kill a Muslim as punishment because, let's say, he killed an infidel, all right? And then he goes on this long tirade about how all these terrorists in Egypt, when they kill Copts and so forth, Coptic Christians, are misusing that verse or that teaching because they're saying, look at us, we're not going to get punished. But then he goes off and says, well, the saying doesn't say that. You will get punished. You just won't get killed. Okay, so the idea, though, is, but the saying that he's ignoring and acting as like a small thing is basically saying the Muslim's blood is more precious than an infidel. And that itself creates the killing because it goes into the mind of Muslims that they are superior. And so, yeah, you're not supposed to indiscriminately kill an infidel or a dhimmi, let's say. But once you're taught to hate them and you're taught their blood is worthless, you'll kill them. So it's the same concept with the forced conversion. It may say that, but when you're taught all these things and then you rationalize, what's wrong with pressuring an infidel? After all, it's altruistic. If I make him become a Muslim, I'm doing him a favor. He'll go to heaven instead of going to hell. He'll become socially, his social station will be uplifted. So there's a lot of rationalizations that go on. And the final point about this, there's no compulsion in Islam. This is my take, and I've never heard this before, but the verse in the Quran seems to me to be a statement. It's not a commandment. It's not an imperative. It's not saying do not force someone to convert to Islam. And it's true. There is no compulsion in religion. Okay, but that doesn't mean a Muslim can't coerce an infidel and torture them and put a sword to their throat and say convert, because the infidel can say no, and therefore there is no compulsion in Islam. He's not forced. So in many ways, it's almost like a statement and not a commandment. It's true. You can't. There is no compulsion. No matter what you do to someone, they can say no, right? That is a possibility, and some do, as we mentioned. But doing it itself is not expressly banned. You can still do it. So that's another take that I rarely hear, but it sort of makes sense and may help explain why forced conversions are an actual nonstop phenomena from the past up until the present.
Raymond, when people get your book, again, Sword and Scimitar, what I highly encourage them to pick up today, they will see that this jihad has been ongoing, that all the different things that the political Islamists say today are not accurate when you just look to the actual history itself. We hear today, Wahhabism. It was Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. That's where all these issues started. That's when Islam became a problem. Raymond, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab wasn't born until 1703. So that people can stop blaming 1,000 years that took place before he was even born. Please let our audience know, and I'll make it very clear, we're not going to say true Islam or radical Islam. Let's label it this way. What is Islam according to Muhammad? We have a couple minutes left.
Well, Islam, according to Muhammad, the word itself is rooted to the word salim, which is also rooted to peace, salam, we know peace, but it also means give up, surrender. and that's how it was used. Okay, and the message he sent to the aforementioned Emperor Heraclius before he died, Muhammad, was in Arabic, it's Aslam Taslam, which means surrender. Aslam is, as you can see, connected to Islam, and have peace. And of course, the logic is if you don't surrender, you will have war, which is what Christendom got for over 1,000 years. So that's what Islam has meant historically, and it was understood. You either become a Muslim, you're one of the team, etc. You're not, and you're an infidel. Your war must be waged on you one way or the other, okay? Or you're subdued and you're dhimmi and you're treated as third, fourth class citizen, whatever, okay? But the point you make about Wahhabis and so forth, these are all terms created by the politically correct elements of Western society for the reason to distance. So Saudi Arabia literally is ruling according to Islamic Sharia, literally is following the Hadith and the Seerah of Muhammad, literally is applying the Quran. And then they'll tell you, well, that's because they're Wahhabis. As if Wahhab, as you pointed out, is the creator of this system, and he's not. He has a historical role. He actually was, you can call him he rejuvenated Islam and brought it back to the way it was, or the way it should have been treated. Right, he was a reformer, okay? But they like to put these terms, he's a Salafi, he's a Wahhabi, or ISIS, it's the Islamic State. And the problem is, while it's important to, think of them as finite temporal groups and institutions, using that sort of terminology doesn't tell us much about what drives them, what motivates them. And if you listen to them, it's not Wahhab, Abdul Wahhab, it's not, Ibn Hanbal, it's not any of these people, it's Islam. It's the sources of Islam, it's their prophet, it's Muhammad, and so forth. But again, this is just one of those games that a lot of Western politically correct elements play just to distance the terror and suffering committed in the name of Islam from Islam.
And no surprise there. At the same time, we do want to separate Islam from Muslims. Islam's a religio-political system. Of course, Muslims are people made in the image of God who ultimately need the gospel. But people need to get educated about the past. And Raymond is a historian. He has multiple degrees in history. He's fluent in English, Arabic, and Greek. No surprise that Raymond doesn't show up on the Islamophobe lists out there, because people would say, what are you talking about? This guy knows his stuff. And you will find a lot of the stuff that he knows in his brand new book, Sword and Scimitar. Please pick this up. Again, you can get it at RaymondIbrahim.com. Raymond, thank you so much for always being a great informative guest and all the work that you do, and for just continually putting new articles on your site all the time. Thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you very much, Tony. I appreciate it.
Friends, think about this. Think about the past and think about the present. This is why what's happening around the world today is happening the way that it is. Get Raymond's book. Get other people informed as well. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you next time on Colliding Worldviews.